You want to discredit me because I'm an Israeli, so I won't discredit you because you're an Irish. You know what? Irish tend to be quite anti-Semitic. This is the study that we just learned. Okay, so this is where we stand.
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 180 for the 22nd of May, 2025.
What did the cops say?
Don't talk to the Jews.
You don't talk to the Jews?
Yeah. No.
Well, most of our viewers are non-Jewish.
Well, you are, so I don't talk to Jews.
Okay, well, talk through me to my Christian viewers.
No, I'm not talking to Jews.
Well, I think that's a very rude thing to say.
I'm not concerned as to whether it's a rude thing to say.
I think it's unchristian, actually.
Well, this is absolutely ridiculous that it's unchristian.
Well, I came to you just to ask you.
You crucified our Lord Jesus Christ.
I wasn't there, brother.
And then you're telling me his blood be upon us and upon our children.
That's the diminutive Justin Barrett, formerly of Youth Defence and a string of other far-right organisations. Litler himself, talking to a commentator from the Canadian YouTube channel Rebel News, itself very much a part of the alt-right. But he showed up in Dublin for the anti-immigration march, and I suppose he expected the crowd there to be a bit more on message. Anyway, I use that clip because it shows both sides of what I always thought were a couple of pretty small niches of anti-Semitic people in Ireland. One, the knuckle-headed morons who fancy themselves as edgy neo-Nazis, and two, a strand of conservative Catholics who mixed their bigotry with a conspiratorial reading of theology. In that clip, Litler manages to lay claim to be in both of those camps, but in reality my impression was always that anti-Semitism in Ireland was never really a very big issue. It's not because Ireland is particularly virtuous, just because there was never a very large Jewish community to be anti-Semitic against in Ireland, and any of the typical conspiratorial complaints against Jews on the continent that they exploited the population, that idea was clearly rebutted by the reality of exploitation by our colonial masters. Another factor is that Ireland didn't take part in World War II. Censorship was so strict that Irish people had little idea what was going on, so the debate, if you can call it that, about the role of Jews in society that you get in most continental countries, that doesn't really exist in Ireland. You can't have missed the slew of accusations of Ireland being anti-Semitic, massively prejudiced against Israel, since the attacks by Hamas on Israel on the 7th of October 2023, and the ensuing massive assault, blockade, and attacks on the civilian population of Gaza by Israeli forces. To me, these attacks seem like fairly cack-handed attempts by Israeli authorities and their supporters to undermine the reputation of their critics. Easy to see through, not believable by anyone who approaches the topic with a modicum of critical thought. One example was the piece written by Lisa Leal on the Times of Israel, the biggest Israeli news website. She wrote, "Most Christians today have become civilized," but she says that there is one exception to that trend. Quote, "The sectarian warfare between Protestants and Catholics in Ireland has resulted in their societal retardation of their culture when it comes to religion. They still feel their ancient Christianity in their bones, and as a result, their views of Jews are closer to those of medieval Christians than those of modern ones." I was aware of this, so when I was pitched an interview with two academics who had researched anti-Semitism in Ireland, I thought that would be an interesting topic to include in the podcast. I read their research and I was pretty surprised. They hired a polling company to test public opinion in Ireland, and essentially their findings were that Irish people are far more likely to express anti-Semitic opinions than other countries that the researchers have studied, such as the US and the UK. I have to say that I was sceptical of this finding for two reasons. First, I want to say that the methodology of the poll, that's to say how they measured the opinions of their sample, that methodology seems to be very professional and follow statistical best practices. But who the sample is, that's a different question. First, the authors, Kirill Bumin and Mordechai Inbari, said that they were measuring the attitudes not of Irish people, but of Irish Christians. And they said that they did this because this was consistent with research they had done in other countries, and that people self-identified as Christians. I'm not sure about this, because the meaning of someone identifying as a Christian in Ireland could mean something different to the same phrasing in the US, for example. Also, in their data, they identified that in their sample, 11.7% of respondents were members of the Church of Ireland. That's far more than the 2.5% in the census. And 14% of the sample said that they were some other Protestant or Orthodox denomination, compared to 4% in the census. So that means that non-Catholic Christians are more than 25% of their sample, despite being less than 7% of the population. It's difficult to know what to make of that, other than to say it's not really clear that their sampling was representative. I should say that there was a problem with the start of the recording. A portion at the beginning was lost, so you don't hear the introduction of Dr. Mordechai Inbari, Professor of Religion at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke, and Kirill Bumin, the Associate Dean of the Metropolitan College of Boston University. But before I go to that, I want to say thanks to all of the patrons on Patreon. I really appreciate everyone who donates on Patreon. It's a great morale boost when we get a new patron every time. It lets us know that there are people out there listening and appreciating the podcast. We make a big effort to cover things that are undercovered in Irish media. You're more than welcome to listen for free, but if you think that you could do the same as the other donors and throw in the price of a cup of coffee once or twice a month, there's details how to do that on the website and at the end of the show. Anyway, to the interview with Mordechai Inbari, and first you hear speaking Kirill Bumin.
The Irish Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, thank you for correcting me.
No problem.
Said the Irish people have so much sympathy for the Palestinian people because, quote, we see our history in their eyes.
Yeah.
A story of displacement, of dispossession, and national identity questioned and denied, forced immigration, discrimination, and now hunger, end quote. Do you agree with the parallels between Irish and Palestinian experiences that Mr. Varadkar expressed? That's the question that we asked our respondents. 58.5% said yes, they agree with the parallels. 19.7% no, they disagree. And 21.8% said they didn't know how to answer this question. The reason why I bring this up, right, is that I think there is an underlying current in Ireland that's inherently far more pro-Palestinian. The history and the current events are interpreted with a much more pro-Palestinian tint than they do in either Britain or the United States. U.S. has a very, very robust pro-Israel culture. We have conducted a statistical analysis among the immigrants in the U.S. We asked people how long they have been to the United States after immigrating. And what we found is that the longer an immigrant has been in the United States, the more pro-Israel attitudes they held. Mm-hmm. So there is an assimilation in the pro-Israel culture in the United States. And I think that the general Irish culture is much more likely to assimilate the Irish people to more pro-Palestinian sentiments. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. This is a deeply ingrained attitude, obviously, with almost 60% of the respondents agreeing with this.
Kirill, let me ask you a question about that in that case. Mm-hmm. Because what you're saying is that apparently the center of gravity, which brings the rest of the population towards it, in the US is more pro-Israeli and in Ireland less so, or perhaps more pro-Palestinian. Correct. On that. to me, the flaw that jumps out of at me from that is to assume that perhaps you as Americans, or at least living in America, assume that America is normal and everything that is different to America is an abnormality because it is different to America. I can't imagine anybody in Ireland who could imagine that Leo Varadkar has any background that would make him anti-Semitic or has demonstrated anything along those lines. There may be other people in Ireland who you could not say about, but not Leo Varadkar. My point being...
I tend to disagree. And here's the reason why I disagree.
Allow me to put the point first. Kirill, allow me to put the point first. My point is that there is a conflict, and people will see that conflict for the information that they get from it and news media and so forth, and they will see that through a lens of their own experience and their own beliefs and so forth. That lens, it's not reasonable to say that lens, that the American lens is the correct one and every other one is a variation from that. And it is objectively true that the Palestinian people have suffered enormously and have, I don't want to rehearse that argument, but it certainly cannot be said that there is an objective, absolutist point of view that one side, or the Israeli side, at least in that Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is objectively right and the others is not. Or do you disagree? Kirill, go ahead.
No, I completely agree with you. There is no objective standard. You sit where you stand, and U.S. is a reference point for us because we study the U.S. predominantly.
Yeah.
But I don't necessarily assume that American position is the quote-unquote right one or the righteous one or whatever you want to call it, right? What I will say, however, is that your blanket statement that anti-Israel state sentiments that the prime minister has expressed are inherently non-anti-Semitic is wrong. Some anti-Israeli sentiments are also anti-Semitic statements.
Absolutely, I agree 100%. Some, yes.
And anyone who denies the right of Israel to exist, but allows for the right of national self-determination to anyone else, is inherently anti-Semitic.
Yeah,
because
I
if
agree.
only Jews do not have the right to a state of their own, that's an anti-Semitic statement.
Yes.
Okay,
I understand that. I understand that. Pause on that, Kirill.
Precisely in this way.
I will say, it seems obvious to me, I think it should be obvious to anybody else, that Israel, as per any other country, has a right to exist and a right to defend itself. And that...
Strangely enough, only 19% of Irish people thought
pause, Kirill, pause.
That Israel has the right to defend itself.
Pause for the question.
Okay.
Because that right flows from international law and from things like the Helsinki Accords and international diplomatic accepted standards and practices. It is unquestionably the case, it is objectively true, that Israel is breaching international law and has in the most egregious ways for many years and has not faced consequences for that. People can
William,
pause for a second. Kirill, pause. Allow me to put the question.
No. Listen,
okay.
This is not what we do. We are not here to discuss our opinions about Israel. We're not here to discuss what we think the Irish should do or what the Americans should do.
Okay, then precisely what did Leo Varadkar say that you think could be called anti-Semitic? Which precise point do you think he made?
Nothing. My point is I didn't say it was anti-Semitic.
Okay.
What I did say was that there is a general pro-Palestinian bias in the Irish society. That's what I said. And I stand by it. I didn't say I didn't say that pro-Palestinian means inherently anti-Semitic.
Kirill, can I say something? I am Irish. I have been to different countries around the world, in Asia, in the Americas and so forth, and Irish people who have travelled will notice this, that somebody will ask them, where are they from? And it might take several minutes of explaining for the person to recognise, Ireland, that island up there, North Atlantic. But very frequently, when that recognition is made, you will get a huge smile and say, oh, Ireland, yes, and there will be a very positive reaction to that. That reaction is, you could perhaps call pro-Irish, but it is not anti-anyone. And being in favour of, or even offering special recognition to particular causes or the appeal that they may have in other countries, doesn't imply or doesn't say that a person who has that positive attitude gets that positive attitude from a negative or bigoted or racist opinion against their perceived adversaries. People who see suffering and sympathize with it are, just because they're sympathizing with people who are suffering, does not make them bigoted against people who they perceive to cause that suffering.
What does that have to do with the fact that 49.2% of Irish people, Irish Christians in our survey, told us that they believe the Jews are disloyal and that they're more loyal to Israel than they are to Ireland?
I find that very troubling. Nothing is a short answer.
Let me add a little bit.
Marty, speak.
Yes, 64% said Israel has committed genocide in the current fighting in Gaza. So, and another 60%, Israel deliberately target Palestinian citizens. Now, these are gross exaggerations, with all due respect.
But are they untrue?
Genocide.
Are they untrue?
You know what is genocide?
I do.
Okay,
yes.
let's define what genocide.
Yeah, I can.
Genocide.
Yeah, I can sympathize with the excessive use of extreme language in that, but I don't believe that either of those indicate anti-Semitism.
They do not. But we've asked a battery of questions that are asked around the world in more than 100 countries by a respected international organization.
Yeah.
Right. This has been done repeatedly. Right. So these questions are vetted. They're considered to be legitimate. Right. And the results that we get among Irish Christians, when we compare those very same questions with Americans and with the British people, present a fundamental problem.
Yeah, I'm not denying that. And looking at your survey, there is some stuff that is very uncomfortable. And as Moti said, that is not something to be swept under the carpet. That's not something to be ignored. But I'm questioning, in the spirit of enlightenment, I want to understand and verify both the methodology and the results of what you're coming up with. Would you agree? So first of all, I agree that that association is very problematic, of associating and, quote, blaming Jews as a group for policies and actions of the Israeli government. I think that's a bad idea, right, and it's in its sloppy thinking.
And you know that there are many Israelis also that are very much against the government, by the way.
Indeed, of course, yeah. And it is notable that far more than in other countries, you will find in Israel unbelievably brave people who, in the face of very, very serious social and other consequences, who will stand up to the things that their government is doing that they believe is wrong. I don't dispute that for one moment. But a couple of questions, and I don't want to play reverse Uno on you on that, but I have seen several stories that are really quite shocking that portray Israeli attitudes towards Ireland, and to say that they are wrong doesn't begin to describe, just how silly. And one I would point to was an online columnist with the Times of Israel, a woman called Lisa Leal, wrote an article on the Times of Israel website, which was later deleted. But it is just a carnival of cliches. That she doesn't mention leprechauns in it is the only Irish trope in there. But just let me read out what she's saying. But we're talking about Ireland. But there's one place in the Christian world where religion has remained a very, very immediate and critical issue, even a life and death issue. And she's essentially saying, and she seems to have a very strange view of the conflict in Northern Ireland, and saying the sectarian warfare between Protestants and Catholics in Ireland, she doesn't seem to distinguish between the North and the South, has resulted in their societal retardation of their cultures when it comes to religion. They still feel their ancient Christianity in their bones, and as a result, their views of Israel are closer to those of medieval Christians than those of modern ones. It would be odd if they were not anti-Semitic given all of that. That's just hot nonsense, isn't it?
Yeah, look, we cannot be standing behind things like that. We don't.
No, but there does seem to be very, very strange and ill-informed attitudes in Israel towards Ireland, and Ireland seems to have been sort of singled out as a fairly convenient hate figure.
Right. Well, it seems like Irish very much like to hate Jews, hate Israel. No?
I'm utterly baffled by that, and I think if you listen to everybody on the political spectrum in their condemnation of Israeli actions in Gaza most recently and in the conflict, they will be very careful to say that they renounce anti-Semitism. And it is true, it is the case that Irish people see a parallel between the plight of the Palestinians and Irish people, and that level of human empathy can't just be written off as bigotry against one religion, can it?
There could have been, there could have been other parallels. For example, both Israel and Ireland were British colonies.
Yeah,
both
that's true.
Israel and there could have been other parallels. Yeah, and
so Israel, for example, right? Both British colonies.
Yeah.
Israel and Ireland.
Yeah.
Right.
With
Very similar
extensive
experience for
diasporas.
Independence.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah,
and Israel also had undergrounds that fought the British powers and tried to expel them.
Yeah.
So there could have been other parallels, that were made. And I think also the war in Gaza began with a massacre.
I understand.
And people tend to forget that massacre.
Yeah. That is unquestionably true, and that is something that must not be forgotten. But one thing I would say on that, Moti, is that you cannot demand perfection of victims. And it may be much easier to find an innocent 6-year-old girl or whatever as a victim, and there have been those, but that's clearly not all of the people who've been killed by a long stroke. But just because somebody might be a 19-year-old boy or man rather than a 6-year-old girl, that doesn't justify them being killed in the circumstances that has happened. Can you accept that Irish people see the response of the Israeli government as massively disproportionate and as worsening the problem? I'm not expecting you or asking you to agree that that is true, but that's not an unreasonable thing to say, and it is entirely consistent for somebody who does not have an anti-Semitic bone in their body to say that.
Well, I think that the results show that there are some anti-Semitic bones in the Irish body. I think this is a matter of fact now. It's proven.
I have to remain skeptical on that. Kirill, go
William,
ahead.
Yeah, I will agree. I will give you that this is a legitimate position, that someone could be totally not anti-Semitic and have very strong feelings, negative feelings about Israeli response to the 10/7 attacks.
Mm-hmm.
I understand that, right? We never argued in any of our op-eds, in any of our releases, and will never argue that someone who is anti-Zionist is inherently and absolutely and anti-Semite. The two don't necessarily go hand in hand. And as Moti pointed out, there are a number of Israelis that disagree with the Israeli government response to 10/7, and they protest quite often. So it's legitimate to say that there are Irish people that hold very critical views of the Israeli policy in their prosecution of the Gaza invasion, without being anti-Semitic. There are a number of people in the U.S. and elsewhere that hold, very critical views of Israeli actions without being anti-Semitic. The problem is that while we can accept all of this, right? Mm-hmm. What I'm hearing from you and the way you ask the questions and the way you phrase things is you, and perhaps many Irish, are not willing to accept the other side of the coin, right? And that is that anti-Zionism is oftentimes informed by latent and sometimes not latent. Sometimes
I actually agree with you. I think you're correct. And I think that there is a handy cover for people who are anti-Semitic, who can kind of put on the shawl of being opposed to Israeli government policies. And I think that is convenient. I don't want to go down the road of arguing whether that's a convenience that is offered to them by Israeli government policy. But just let me put, because I researched this, to you a couple of historical facts and one personal anecdote to you. Daniel O'Connell, you may or may not know, is probably the greatest statesman of Ireland regarded of the past 2 centuries. The biggest street in the centre of Dublin is O'Connell Street, named after him. The biggest statue on that street is of him. Probably every Irish town of any size has a street named after him. He is that great a figure because he led the campaign for what was called emancipation, Catholic emancipation, when Catholics of Ireland, who were a large majority, were not allowed to vote or participate in society in many other ways. What is not as well known, even by Irish people, is that Daniel O'Connell explicitly included in that also Jewish emancipation. Although there were very few Jewish people in Ireland, that law also covered England and Wales and insisted that Jewish people had to be enfranchised and emancipated in the same way, and they were. Daniel O'Connell was responsible for the Judaismo law, which required Jewish people until about 150 years ago to wear specific clothes when they were in England. So they were marked out, and that was obviously a factor in anti-Semitic attacks, that they were required to wear specific clothes. In my living memory, all three of the major parties, as was in Ireland, have had senior members in Parliament who were Jewish. Mervyn Taylor was a cabinet minister from the Labour Party. Alan Shatter was cabinet minister from Fine Gael, Leo Varadkar's party. And previously, Ben Briscoe was the mayor of Dublin and member of Parliament for Fianna Fáil, the other large party. And Bob Briscoe, his father, was also mayor of Dublin in the 1950s. And the personal anecdote is my American aunt came to Dublin, I remember, and said that she had previously visited Dublin in the 1950s or 1960s. And her view was that Ireland must be a terribly liberal place because the mayor of Dublin was Jewish. And I said, really, who was that? And she said, there was this guy, Bob Briscoe. And I didn't recognize the full name, but I knew Briscoe was more recently the mayor, his son. And I knew he was the mayor of Dublin. I didn't know he was Jewish for the simple reason that it wasn't discussed, and literally nobody cared. And the last point that I will give is that the Irish Constitution, which was enacted in 1937, and 1937 was a very, very significant year to be Jewish in Europe. In 1937, written into the Irish Constitution, was that Jewish people were part of the Irish nation. And that remains in the Constitution to this day. And I don't dispute and I don't question that there are people out there who have essentially stupid ideas and who accept unthinkingly some of these tropes. I think that there is a much smaller number of people who are more actively anti-Semitic. But from having lived in Ireland and having lived in Britain, I just can't imagine that Ireland is significantly worse than many other countries. And I've been, for example, in Berlin, and not just the synagogue, also the Jewish Museum, also every little Jewish bakery has a permanently built police post outside it with armed police and very heavily armed police. And I walked past them quite a few times before I realized those police weren't there to protect the Jewish people. Those police were there to protect Germany, because if any idiot came along and painted a swastika on the synagogue, that would rightly be on the front page of every newspaper around the world, and that's why those police were there. But you can say
it's an interesting perspective.
Yes,
I've been to Germany many times,
and you will have seen the protection of all Jewish sites. Yeah.
My impression at those Jewish sites was always that those policemen were there to provide protection to the Jewish people.
I think you're right. I mean, I'm being slightly sarcastic, but I think those police are also there fully in the knowledge that if some idiot painted a swastika on the synagogue, that would be hugely damaging to Germany. But I just can't believe that, and I have seen it, and I have seen anti-Semitism in Germany, and I've seen it in Britain, and I can't say it has been zero in Ireland, but most of it has been pretty rare, and that which exists comes from an acceptance of Christian tropes unthinkingly, that they're not really associating with human beings, that essentially Irish people who follow this, small enough in number, who've expressed this, the Jews killed Jesus, they're essentially seeing them as Shylock, as a mythical figure. But having given that soliloquy to you and spoken to you on that, let me ask you guys another question. Kirill, I know you come originally from Belarus and you've lived in the US. Moti, I didn't get a chance to speak to you, but from your accent, I had a wild guess. I'd say that you are Israeli or you have some contacts there. You were smiling at me. Am I correct with my... Do I detect the accent correctly?
Yeah, you have.
Okay.
Yeah.
How, Moti, then in particular, in terms of bigotry towards other religions, how would you measure Israelis?
Don't flip the conversation.
Oh, why not?
I didn't come to talk about Israel. We came to talk about Ireland and our survey. Now, you mentioned how, all kinds of things, and also about how wonderful Irish people have been to Jews. And I want to mention that also the Limerick boycott, the Limerick boycott or the Limerick pogrom, just also to remind that also once you're bringing historical records of Irish behavior toward Jews, So why won't you bring also that? Don't forget
That's absolutely reasonable. I think to call it pogrom, and I have read about that, and in fact in my research I did read about that, and I should mention that it is probably worthwhile saying that one rabbi was hit by a stone on the ankle. That was the totality of the violence on that. And I don't want to minimize that, and I would say more seriously in terms of anti-Semitism would have been Arthur Griffith, who was the founder of Sinn Féin in the revolutionary period, and he would have been called an anti-Dreyfusard. And that was very much picking up on anti-Semitism that was very prevalent on the continent at that time. And I agree indeed. I do feel entitled to flip the script. Go ahead and answer. Be a sport.
Let me say something.
Go ahead,
to
Kirill,
you,
first.
Right?
Yeah.
Much of what you said in the last 5 minutes was around, if you would ask an Irish person about their feelings towards Jews, they wouldn't tell you that these anti-Semitic things. And that's true. That's probably true of the vast majority of the people around the world, not just the Irish.
Yeah.
If you ask them up front, right, face to face, do you hate Jews or do you endorse one of these tropes? Unless you're like a straight up Nazi or fascist, you'll probably say, even if you hold these opinions, oh, no, I don't believe this. I don't think this is true. One of the beauties of our survey is that it provides people that veneer of anonymity and that ability to be genuinely and fully honest with the survey questions, because they're not being outed. Nobody knows who they are. Nobody can point a finger and say, ooh, you said that, or you said this. And I think that in those conditions of an anonymous survey taken online where you don't have to face an interviewer, people tend to be more honest. And I think perhaps, right, it's a possibility that you are underestimating the degree to which some of these latent anti-Semitic feelings exist in Ireland. And that many people don't feel comfortable expressing publicly, but they feel them nonetheless.
Yeah. I would say I agree. I agree. Go ahead.
I want to say one more thing.
Yeah.
The fact that there are no Jews living in Ireland is part of the problem. Because if Irish people would have known Jews personally, yes, if they were working with a Jew, if they had a Jew neighbor, if they're in school someone, if they have known Jews, then Jews would not have been an abstract figure,
That's what I meant by Shylock, yeah. I agree. But not no Jews. I mean, the number of Jewish people in Ireland is pretty stable. I've looked at the census returns, and it's about 2,000 Jewish people, and that's been steady for decades. But I agree with you that prejudice can sometimes be against an abstract figure rather than a person who lives down the street from you. I'm not sure if that's necessarily better or worse, and that does go to explain this vastly lower incidence found by the University of Tel Aviv of anti-Semitic incidents. But I am going to press you on it, Moti. You are happy to compare Ireland to other countries, but let's compare it to Israel. In terms of prejudice of Israelis, how would you think it compares, just from your knowledge of the population?
What exactly are you asking?
I'm saying
prejudice toward what?
I guess in Israel the Palestinian population is the obvious prime target, but would your instinct be that people would be more prejudiced than how you find Irish people to be, for example?
We actually conducted surveys asking Israelis what they think about Christians, what they think about Christians.
Yeah.
They are not, there are Orthodox communities who tend to be more suspicious toward Christians and Christianity, but overall Israelis are quite indifferent. They don't have negative feelings toward Christianity or Christians.
And towards Muslims?
And you're talking, and you ask about the Palestinians and Muslims, you have to understand that Israel is at war now, yes?
Yeah.
With Palestinians, so you can expect that those feelings might be stronger feelings toward.
I'm sure you're not surprised, William, that the most anti-Semitic place in the world, according to ADL, is the Palestinian territories.
No, I'm not. I'm not sure.
Parties to a conflict are inherently going to hold much more belligerent views towards each other than the outsiders.
Yeah, we didn't ask in our survey, for example, in Ireland, what is the view of British people? And I guess if we would have asked that, we probably have seen some very nice nasty things happening. We didn't ask that, yes?
Possibly, but I think it is quite subtle and sophisticated, and people switch on British TV stations and watch British soap operas every day and follow British football teams as well, and once in a while even look at the Queen's speech or the King's speech, probably with an ironic view, but the relationship between Britain and Ireland is and probably always will be very complex.
So the relationship between Israel and its Palestinian neighbors might also be complex because there's a conflict.
Yeah. What do you think of Israeli, asking Moti in particular, politicians who say in a variety of ways that they want to essentially expel all Palestinians from both Israel and the occupied territories?
It's not going to happen. It's just, okay.
Clearly it's not going to happen.
They speak it.
But the fact that there are significant elected figures who state that as an ambition.
So what are you trying here to create a parallel? So Irish people are anti-Semitic, but Israelis are worse.
I'm not. That's a fair question. That's a fair question, Moti. No, that's a fair question.
All of your statements have been hinting toward the fact that you are probably yourself a little bit anti-Semitic, and just pay attention to what you say.
No. Well, allow me to tell you. So, that's a fair comment to ask why I'm asking the question. And let me say why. Because I think we are all human and we have to be judged in the context of being human rather than against a perfect ideal. And I absolutely agree that there is a submerged level of anti-Semitism in many countries, including Ireland. My instinct is that it is lower in Ireland, not for any reason that that Ireland is particularly virtuous or anything like that, but two reasons. One, because Ireland's Jewish population is very small, and two, because Ireland didn't take part in World War II, and that whole conflict, which included the Holocaust, Ireland was essentially aside from that and didn't participate in that. But the reason I ask you that is because there is a feeling amongst people in Ireland who would have great sympathy with the Palestinians, in my view, not out of any anti-Semitic reason, that essentially the mirror image of what you are proposing also exists, and that it has been observed, for example, that even very large-scale respectable news organizations like the BBC, in their language, will persistently say that an Israeli was killed by Palestinians, and in a mirror image incident will say that Palestinians died following an exchange of fire or whatever. And the language where Israelis are the victim or the people who are suffering is, and this can be quite easily measured, is amped up, and where it is Palestinians, it is toned down. And that's pretty obvious across a whole range of things, and you can see, for example, the reaction.
William, this is a perfect example of you sit where you stand. Here in the United States, the vast majority of people would say that BBC is virulently anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli.
Yeah, but but that can be objectively measured. And for example, that can be objectively measured whether you use active or passive verbs when describing what Israel does and what Palestinians do. And for example, quite rightly, there's some great concern about Iran getting nuclear bomb, which is illegal under international treaties. Israel, it is no secret, has nuclear weapons, which is equally illegal. And the difference between Iran and Israel is that Iran has not invaded any of its neighbors and Israel has. And the reaction to that nuclear threat of Iran and Israel is very, very different. And what I'm saying to you is, I actually agree with you guys 100% that there are unfair double standards applied to Jewish people.
Iran is not invaded. Let me tell you about Iran not invading.
I am no friend. I am no friend of Iran.
Have you heard of the Hezbollah?
Yes, I have.
Have you heard of Hamas? Have you heard of the Houthis?
Yeah.
Have you heard all of those things? These are all proxies. This is
That's
all
correct.
Iran.
That is correct.
And Iran shot Israel twice in the last war. Twice.
Yeah.
With the ballistic missiles. Don't speak
like
that. This really shows your anti-Semitic attitudes. You are an anti-Semite. You are representing the problem that we saw in Ireland.
Hold on, Moti. I know you feel this very passionately about this, but I'm asking a question, and I do not for one moment hold a candle for the Iranian government, believe me. But there is objectively a parallel there. Both Iran and Israel are breaching international law on nuclear weapens, and it is objectively true that the treatment of Iran doing that and Israel
I
doing
have
the
to leave
reaction
in a
doing
second.
that. I'm aware, Kirill, you have a hard out there on that.
Let me mention one last thing before I sign off, right? I think what you want us to do is engage in a partisan argument with you about who's right, who's wrong.
No, I don't. I think that's a dead argument.
Well, but that's what we've been doing.
To a degree, yeah.
Yeah. And I think what you need to understand is that Morty and I approached this subject as real scientists.
Mm-hmm.
We genuinely want to understand why people feel and think the way they do. Okay? Our personal biases are irrelevant in that respect. We're interested in studying and understanding public opinion related to the Christian-Jewish relations and to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? We're not trying to make Irish out to be anti-Semites. We're not trying to make Americans seem like saints when it comes to anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm.
We have no political agenda. Our agenda is purely scholarly. Okay, and so when our findings show something that's undesirable, we report it nevertheless. Some evangelical organizations in the U.S. are not happy with us because some of the things that we've revealed about evangelicals are not particularly positive, right? It doesn't matter to us. What we are trying to do is do proper scholarly work. And we are transparent about our funding sources. We're transparent about our samples and the challenges that come with sampling that population. And we're open to discussing our results. Interpretation of those results and partisan feelings about those results, that's something that we explicitly and deliberately leave out, because that's not what we're doing here. And so in some respects, I really regret that our conversation devolved into these partisan discussions that frankly have nothing to do with the work that we do.
Kirill, I'm trying to test the arguments. I know that you've been very generous with both with your time and with your work, and I'm trying to test the quality of those arguments, and I particularly want to give you a chance to present those to Irish people, for Irish people to listen to. And I agree that to an extent that is probably submerged, that not all Irish people really acknowledge that there are prejudiced feelings out there, and I think it is important to take a long, hard look at those. I'm aware that you have to sign off, so I will put a question to Moti.
Take care.
Take care, Kirill. Bye-bye. You clearly feel passionately about that. And we heard there Kirill saying how he wanted to be a scientist and to analyze things very systematically and in an objective way. Are you sure that you're doing that? Are you sure that your feelings, which are clearly very passionate, are not coming into this?
No. We ask questions. The questions are clear. We get the results. It's not convenient for you and maybe for your listeners to acknowledge this, and you're trying to rebut them in this and that way, and trying to test, to say that I'm that I'm not an objective scholar or whatnot. Okay.
Well, I'm trying to ask, not say.
I leave you with that. I think that I'm doing a professional work, and the fact that you look at the mirror and you said the mirror is crooked, so I guess it's probably your problem, and you prefer not to acknowledge the issues, but to attack the messenger. Okay, so attack the messenger. Fine. Say, oh, this is an Israeli. Okay, so he's not legitimate scholar. Why not? Okay, so if this is what you want to,
I don't think I've said that.
Yeah. Well, listen. The Israeli government closed the embassy in Dublin, and there's probably a reason for that. And the numbers that we have seen kind of hint that there is some problem in Dublin. And if the Dublin people don't want to acknowledge it and say that the messenger, we should kill the messenger. Okay, so kill the messenger, and you're going to stay with your biases and with your anti-Semitism, and you feel very happy about it. Maybe you can have a beer. That's what I have to say.
Okay, are you sure that I've said that? Because I've brought you on, and I've tried very hard to listen and to take on board what you're saying. And are you sure that it's legitimate that when I ask you, and note that I put it in the form of a question, when I ask you questions to establish if your methodology is sound, you view that, as it seems from what you've said, as an attack. It's certainly not intended as an attack, but isn't it legitimate in any science to use questioning to establish whether any findings are sound?
Okay, you know what? I want to challenge you.
Yeah.
So you take this survey and run it yourself.
Yeah.
And see what. No, this is the best test to see if a survey is correct or not, if it is repeated again.
If an experiment, if it is repeatable,
Yeah.
that's absolutely true in science. But the question then is, exactly what are you measuring? And the reason I asked you about public opinion in Israel is not to try and put that back at you, but to see if what you are asking is an objective standard. And
so we took the ADL, you know,
Sure.
ADL, we took their measurement of anti-Semitism, and guess what?
yeah,
Yeah. We took their measurement, and guess what? You know, you came really poorly. The numbers are very poor, and we compare it with British, we compare it with Americans, and you say, okay, the survey is crooked. Okay, so this is.
I didn't say the survey is crooked.
Okay, so you
I
can
asked
live in
questions.
peace. You can live in peace with yourself. You are good, righteous people. You are not anti-Semitic. Everything is good and well. And those scholars who came from America, they don't know what to.
But Moti,
So you can live. You're right. The mirror is crooked. You're right.
Moti, if you are asking somebody to be self-reflective, which is a reasonable thing to do, isn't it reasonable for them to say that you could also be self-reflective? And it seems to me that you're reacting to questioning from me, and I'm trying to be questioning and to give you space to answer the questions, but you're reacting to that questioning by just assuming bad faith.
Yeah, it does sound like that. I'm sorry, William.
Is it
sounds
not
like bad faith? Yeah, it does.
It's identify that precisely, because I feel sad that you feel like that, and I want you to precisely say what you feel is bad faith.
Yeah, for example, you said the reason why. Let me show your anti-Semitism.
Sure.
Yeah, you said that they put in Germany police officers at the entrance to Jewish shops. No, because Germany doesn't want to look bad. You don't think that it's because of they are concerned for the safety of, there's a much larger Jewish community living in Germany, and there's also a large Muslim community living in
True,
Germany.
yeah.
If you know that, so this is, for example, you didn't mention that there's in Ireland you don't have a big immigration outside of and big immigration into the Middle East. You don't have from the Middle East. You don't have it in Ireland.
There's a significant number of Muslims in Ireland.
Significant.
How
significant?
I don't know.
How significant?
We'll find it. I'm happy to look it up.
I have looked it up in your census. It's only a handful of percentage, maybe 3%.
It has increased very significantly in recent years.
And let me tell you something, it's going to increase dramatically. And you know why? Because Ireland is about to accept 100,000 Palestinians from Gaza. This is something that is coming up to Ireland. So,
when was this decision made?
This is part of the discussions right now between the Trump administration and your government. So I'm giving you some news report for you to know. So that you're gonna accept 100,000 people from Gaza. It's coming up, and it's coming up very soon.
Moti, you're asking me to be reflective and self-critical, and I accept that challenge. But I think maybe you could as well. Are you saying that is a decision that has been made, or that is a proposal that exists?
I know that it is in the discussions right now.
But you said it is going to happen.
Yes.
Okay, but it's in discussions, or it is going to happen?
Because you're going to accept them, and then you get less taxes to pay, less tariffs on your products. Yes, that's part of the negotiations.
I have to say, that sounds like an improbable outcome.
Okay, so wait and see.
Okay, I'm happy to have a civilized discussion with you and to assume good faith on your part. But the way in which you are asking for self-reflection, is it illegitimate to ask you to do that in return, the same?
Yeah, I'm doing it all the time.
Okay.
Our research goes through peer review. We published a book with Oxford University Press. Now we are going to publish another book with Oxford University Press. Our study is going through peer review, through the review of experts. And, if there are issues that we need to correct, we are correcting them. It's not, and it's part of being an academic. Academics have to go through this process of peer review.
Sure, I understand it. Yeah. That's well known. Yeah. To ask you finally, and I appreciate your time, but to ask you finally one other question, and I think Kirill, when he was on, also mentioned that there is a degree to which political opposition to the Israeli government elides into anti-Semitism, and I think he is correct in that observation. Is it possible that's also true on the other side, that there is an opposition, or let's say a promotion of Judaism, shall we say, which elides into excusing what should be inexcusable behavior on the part of the Israeli government?
What does it relate to the survey that we've done?
Not a lot, but you've widened out our discussion quite a lot, so I'm responding to that.
If you want to interview me as an expert on Israel, we can have a discussion, but this is not the reason why we are here right now.
That's true, but that's a reasonable point to make. And
no, you're trying to blend those things together in order to discredit this research. And okay, so feel free to do that, and it's fine. We will finish our conversation right now. And now you have a headline. Dublin can expect 100,000 Palestinians from Gaza coming to you very, very soon.
I'm sorry you take that attitude, Marty, because I want to have a pleasant conversation with you, and I don't feel any hesitation about speaking with somebody who I disagree with in a pleasant and collegiate way.
You're trying to discredit my research because I'm an Israeli.
No, I'm not.
Okay, but it's fine. And I told you what I think about you. I think you're an anti-Semite, and it's fine. It's okay. We know now the level where we are standing. You're saying I'm a Jew, and I say you're an anti-Semite. Okay, we're fine. At least we know, and your listeners will know as well, where we stand. I'm not ashamed to be a Jew, and I'm not ashamed to be an Israeli. Those days are gone when Jews lower their head when the Gentiles come and hit them on the head. Now, you're an anti-Semite. It's very clear.
You've made that accusation a bunch of times. Yeah. Remind me what your justification of that is.
We are speaking already more than an hour and 20 minutes, and I think that's enough. We made our points. You don't want to listen, don't listen.
I absolutely want to listen.
You want to discredit me because I'm an Israeli, so I won't discredit you because you're an Irish. You know what? Irish tend to be quite anti-Semitic. This is the study we just learned. Okay, so this is where we stand. Bye-bye, William, and have a nice day.
Motti, can I...
So, I hear you're an anti-Semite now, Father.
Apparently. Yeah, I was quite shocked by that. By the turn in that interview. Obviously, we had a snafu at the start of the recording, which is quite unfortunate, but I was really taken aback by that. I wanted to kind of examine what the researchers had to say in a open-minded way. I read their research before I did the interview, and I thought that there were some flaws in it, and I thought it was reasonable to present that to them. And I think there's good evidence that some of their conclusions may be at least incomplete, if not incorrect, and I think it was reasonable to put that to them. So to be fairly vigorously accused of being an anti-Semite at the end of that was a bit of a shock.
And to be fair to the researchers, anti-Semitism, and I think any kind of bigotry, can exist on a spectrum, and it occurs to me that many of your objections to the conclusions that were presented in the interview, to the idea that there's widespread anti-Semitism, they only seem to work if you're talking about the kind of extremely manifest anti-Semitism rather than more subtle, problematic attitudes that Irish people might hold. So I wonder if you could respond to that.
I think obviously there's a large and active Jewish population in the US, and Ireland, having been neutral in World War II, is probably the country that just has has this issue lowest on our radar. And I think that the researchers were coming in maybe with a different frame of reference than actually exists in Ireland or that is relevant to Ireland. But I am absolutely not naive about anti-Semitism in Ireland. I would never suggest that it doesn't exist. It most certainly does. I think it exists in several different ways. There are some minuscule groups of knuckle-headed people who, I think would at least be at risk of being violent if they were able to read and find out where they might find some Jewish people. But I think that number of people is so minuscule, it doesn't really contribute to the discussion. But I think there are people in Ireland, maybe a certain type of older Catholic who sort of buys into the Jews killed Jesus type of rhetoric. I don't know if those people would ever do anything that would actually harm any Jewish people. But that's, I don't like that. I think it's quite worrying. But I think that is a very, very unusual thing these days in Ireland. It's only an attitude held by a pretty small minority as well.
I suppose I want to dig deeper on the idea that there are no unproblematic attitudes that might be anti-Semitic. And maybe I want to talk about your edifying, optimistic view of how Irish people look at kind of geopolitical affairs, because you seem to put, because obviously the idea of Israel and Palestine and that conflict came up, and it seems to me that you are of the view that we have a humanitarian view, a humanistic or human rights based point of view, and we're sympathetic in that way. But I've heard it said that Irish people should be as interested in other conflicts or other humanitarian crises that are in some way analogous. For example, the Saudi coalition and the conflict in Yemen, a conflict that involves the Houthis, who are also kind of interested involved in the Israel-Palestine, and the way that is kind of similar. And there don't seem to be as many people who have a strong opinion about that. There seems to be an inconsistency there, and so maybe I wanted to ask, look, are you sure that it is as consistent and as kind of human rights based, the Irish point of view in Palestine and Israel, as you seem to think?
I'm not sure that is that. I don't know how I seem to think, but I'm not sure that it is entirely free of anti-Semitism, and I think it's a completely valid criticism to talk about imposing a higher standard or expecting a higher standard of behaviour of Israel than of other countries. I think there is a potential for that to be a vehicle for anti-Semitism. And it's notable that the conflict in Yemen, the conflict in East Africa, doesn't have as much purchase in Ireland as currently the Palestine-Israel conflict does. One of the reasons for that could be some sort of subtle latent anti-Semitism. There are other potential explanations of that. One is proximity, and just physical proximity, but also proximity via the United States, which Ireland is very culturally close to. Proximity that comes from the experience of Irish soldiers who served in the Lebanon. Also just, proximity in terms of cultural proximity. Israel is not an English-speaking country, but it has a very high proportion of English speakers. It has very strong attachments to, less so to Ireland, although we've had an Irish president of Israel, and the proximity of Israel to Britain and to the United States rubs off on Ireland as well. So that would explain a higher level of interest. But I don't for a moment want to diminish the point that there are also horrendous humanitarian disasters caused by wars quite deliberately by, for example, Saudi Arabia. And it's reasonable to at least discuss why one gets more attention than the other.
So, you've mentioned as well that you seem to have some issues with the conclusions that can be drawn from the survey. But I wanted to ask, do you believe that the survey itself accurately measures or reflects the attitudes of Irish Christians?
Yeah, that's last word in that question is important. Irish Christians. So, number one, I spoke actually to two different sources in the industry, in the opinion polling industry. And the analysis of the data from the sample is absolutely, to use a word, kosher. That's done professionally and within the norms that are accepted in the industry. What I am suspicious of is, number one, why it was Irish Christians who were surveyed. That leaves out a certain chunk of the population, obviously a minority of the population, but it's not clear to me what the rationale for that is. And secondly, I would wonder what the definition of Christian, given that you had a self-selecting group, people who self-identified as Christians, given that you had that self-selecting group, I wonder if that was as reasonable as the researchers seem to think. Because in Ireland, I think particularly a lot of Catholics, people from a Catholic background, the 68 or whatever percent of people in the census who tick Catholic, I think a large proportion of them, if they saw something that was being addressed to Irish Christians, might not think that it was being addressed to them because of the way they perceive what is Christianity and what is Catholicism. And I think that plays through, because you can see one thing in the survey is that although they said that they had a representative sample of Irish Christians, in fact 11.7% of their respondents were members of the Church of Ireland, which is remarkable because the Church of Ireland is only 2.7% of the population, so that's more than 4 times overrepresented. And the Church of Ireland, the Anglican Church, is the Protestant church which is most like the Catholic Church, I think. And people who self-identify as first and foremost Christians rather than by a particular Christian denomination, I think are more likely to be from the more fundamentalist minority Christian sects. So that could be something that is skewing the data there. Also in that there was, for example, in terms of belief in the Bible, more than 50% of the respondents, of all the respondents, said that the Bible is either entirely or at least partly the Word of God. And that's not something that strikes me as typical of Irish Christians, particularly when we have the Irish Bishops' Survey, which reports that more than 10% of Catholics, that's not more than 10% of the population who say they are Catholics, more than 10% of them say they don't believe in God, which is a very Irish way of approaching religion. So the cohort that these guys, these two researchers are reporting on, doesn't seem to me to be representative of that, particularly when they then go on and say, well, 80% of Irish people are Christians, so the implication seems to be that a survey of Irish Christians is more or less the same as a survey of Irish people in general. I'm kind of suspicious of that.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, William.
One other thing I wanted to say was that I don't know whether it made it into it, but at one point in the interview, I remarked that about the incredibly high level of security, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, that is at any Jewish site, any synagogue, the Jewish Museum in Berlin, anything in Germany that has any Jewish thing attached to it will have armed police. And I don't mean police, with a sidearm, like with a revolver or something. I mean with long guns, and they are absolutely determined to protect those sites. And that includes, I'm aware of one small Jewish cafe in Berlin which has a hut built outside it for the 2 armed police who guard that cafe 24 hours a day. And I made the point, those police are protecting, as well as the people in there, the Jewish people there, they are protecting Germany, because if there was some moron came along after a few German beers on a Saturday night and spray painted a swastika on the side of a synagogue in Berlin, that would be obviously upsetting and no doubt worrying for a lot of Jewish people. That would be an absolute catastrophe for Germany. That photograph, you can bet, would be on the front page of every single newspaper on earth. And I think it is reasonable to observe that Germany is protecting. I may have said in the interview that those police are exclusively protecting Germany, and that's probably a bit of over-the-top rhetoric. But I think it is worth pointing out that Germany is quite rightly protecting itself from any moron with a kind of spray paint.
Yeah, no, well, I didn't edit anything of substance out, just the odd hum and ha. But no.
Yes, I do tend to do fairly odd hums and has. Your editing skills are always welcome on that. Kevin, I guess my question to you, Kevin, is, having listened to it, and maybe the listeners can answer this question as well. The listeners can answer themselves. Did anything I say appear as anti-Semitic? Because I was really shocked, and I thought that level of defensiveness amongst the researchers did not stand to them well. Do you want to comment on that, or do you want to leave it to the listeners, Kevin?
I didn't think so. I think maybe you might be come across a little bit defensive of like Irish people, and but I think that's understandable, and it's also understandable that I think to some extent if you were to say, well, what about Israeli people, that someone who comes from Israel would be equally defensive. So I didn't think so. I am not putting myself forward as a authority on that, though. Maybe we leave it to the listeners to decide.
Well, I won't get absolution from you. We'll see if I get it from the listeners. Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, people won't have seen that. It was like making a cross sign, but
Let's not get ourselves into trouble.
Okay, thanks, Ian.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter @Here's How Podcast, and we link to all of the research from the two researchers that we interviewed in the show. You can get in touch if you want to suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. And thanks again to all of the patrons on Patreon. That covers the cost of keeping the podcast going. And if you'd like to throw in a couple of euro once or twice a month, please do go and sign up at patreon.com/here's how. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The co-producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.